In this video, we will be going over lesson 12, which is about unit rates. So first we need to talk about what is a unit rate. A unit rate is a fraction that will always have a 1 in the denominator. So in order for it to be a unit rate, it needs to have this 1 in the denominator here. Like you can see in both of our examples, there's 1 in the denominator, which means that these are both unit rates. So a unit rate is always going to have a 1 in the bottom. If it does not have a 1, then it is not a unit rate. How do we solve for these unit rates? So say I have this question here, and I want to know how many cupcakes can you make with 1 cup of flour? Well, when I look at this ratio here, it tells me that I can make 15 cupcakes with 3 cups of flour. And what we want to do when we're solving these type of questions is we want to set up proportions, which is where you have a fraction equal to another fraction. Okay, this is an example of a proportion. So I need to keep my units on the same. So if I have cupcakes up top on this side, I need to also have cupcakes on top over here. And on the bottom I have cups of flour here, so I'm going to have cups of flour on the bottom over here. Now the question wants to know how many cupcakes I can make with 1 cup of flour, so I know I'm going to have a 1 in my denominator here. So to go from this 3 to this 1, I'm dividing by 3, right? 3 divided by 3 gives me 1. So any math that you do to the bottom, you need to also do to the top. So that means I would take this 15 and I would divide it by 3. 15 divided by 3 gives me 5. So according to my ratio here, I can make 5 cupcakes for every 1 cup of flour. Alright, our first question. Javier jogs 3/4 of a mile in 8.5 minutes. If he keeps at the same pace, how many minutes will it take him to jog 1 mile? Okay. So he goes 3/4 of a mile every 8.5 minutes. So a big part of these problems is being able to set up your ratio, which is what I just did here. This is our ratio, okay? And when in doubt, I would just write it in the order that you read it in the problem, right? In the problem, I read 3/4 first, so I put 3/4 first here, and that's 3/4 of a mile. Don't forget to label it. You have to label it. And then 8.5 minutes, that's right here, and I labeled that as well. I want to know, if he keeps the same pace, how many minutes will it take him to jog 1 mile? Okay, so remember, my units need to stay the same on top and they need to stay the same on bottom. So to get to 1, you always divide any number by itself. Okay, anytime you see a 1, wherever you're starting, you're just dividing by that same number. Over here, I am starting with this 3/4, so I'm going to divide by 3/4. Anything you do to the top, you need to also do to the bottom. So I divided the top by 3/4, I'm going to divide the bottom by 3/4. So I then have this 8.5 divided by 3/4, and this will give me my answer. So you could do this by hand, or what I would suggest is I would always type stuff like this into a calculator, especially when we're dividing with fractions and mixed numbers, just to make sure that we don't make a silly mistake. So here's the calculator I always use, desmos.com, and we're just going to type this into our calculator. So I'm going to hit the fraction button first, and I'm going to do my 8.1/2 in the numerator, and I'm going to divide it by 3/4 in my denominator. And notice how I get this decimal here. I can change this to a fraction if I want. It'll give it to me as a mixed or as an improper fraction. However, I see I have an 11 as my whole number. Right? I have 11 point. So that means I can do 11 first. And then that 0.3 you see repeating, this is equivalent to 1/3. So this means that Javier it'll take him 11 1/3 minutes to jog 1 mile. A recipe calls for 1 1/4 dozen cupcakes, and it calls for 1 2/3 cup of flour, but Rashida only has 1 cup of flour. How many cupcakes can she make? Okay. So here it's telling us to pay close attention to the units. Always remember that when you are writing these, you need to make sure that you are keeping your numbers attached to their units when you're writing your ratio. So 1 1/4 comes first. This is dozen of cupcakes. And our next is 1 2/3 cups of flour. So it says here that she only has 1 cup of flour. So I'm looking for this up here. Remember to go from this 1 2/3 to 1, I'm dividing by this number itself. You just divide by itself. So I'm going to do the same thing up top. Okay. So now I'm going to pull back my calculator. And I'm going to do 1 1/4 divided by 1 2/3. And if I flip this into a fraction, it tells me that I should get 3/4, which means that she can make 3/4 of a dozen. But notice that our question is asking us how many cupcakes, right? Not how much of a dozen. So this is the next part that you have to remember to do. We need to take this 3/4 of a dozen and change it into cupcakes. Well, if I think about a dozen, there's 12 in a dozen. So if I take this 3/4 and multiply it by 12, it will tell me how many cupcakes she can make. Which is 9. So she can make 9 total cupcakes. And we had to do that extra step at the end because that 3/4 is how many dozen cupcakes she can make, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense to not even be able to make 1 full cupcake when I'm using an entire cup of flour. So make sure that you're reading these carefully. They like to throw in some twists and curveballs. Alright, a box of tangerines weighs 5 pounds, costs $4.25. What is the cost per pound? Anytime you see something that looks like this, where it uses the word per, anytime you see per, that is another way of telling you as the solver that they are looking for a unit rate. Okay, so anytime you see the word per, it's you're trying to take whatever they give you and move it into a unit rate. Now here you have to remember the super important fact, which is that money always goes on top. Okay? Whenever you see money and you are writing a ratio, you always need to put your money value on top, which means that 425 would go up top, and this is over 5 pounds. I need it to be a unit rate, which means I need to have a 1 in my denominator. I'm going to divide this by 5. 5 divided by 5 gives me that 1. I need to divide my top by 5. So let's pull back my calculator here. 425 divided by 5 gives me 0.85. So 0.85 is the cost per pound. A map has a scale in which 1.25 inches represents 250 miles. How many miles does 1 inch represent? Okay, so I have 250 miles, and that's 1.25 inches. I want to know how many miles represents 1 inch. So again, always divide by your starting number when you're going to a 1. 1.25 divided by 1.25 gives me 1. Any number divided by itself is 1. Bring back our calculator to type this in. And it looks like that would be 200. So 1 inch represents 200 miles. A bulk store sells 200 candles from brand A for $37.75, and it sells 170 candles from brand B for $35.50. If both brands have the same quality, which one is the better deal? So for both of these, we need to find the unit rate or figure out how much it costs for one candle, and then whichever one is cheaper is obviously going to be the better deal. Remember, money always goes on top. So let's start with company A. 38.75 over 200, and then I'm going to divide top and bottom by 200, and then I'm going to set up my next ratio, which is for company B, which is going to be $35.50 over 170 for 1, divide top and bottom by 170. Okay. Now that I have both my equations set up, I'm going to type these into my calculator. So for this one I have 38.75 and I'm dividing it by 200. And then for the next one I have 35.50 and I'm dividing it by 170. So if I look here, this first one is cheaper, right? This is 0.19. And for company B it is 0.20. So company A is cheaper by 1 penny. So that means that company A has the better deal. So company A has the better deal. Mary can paint 1/4 of a wall in the same amount of time that it takes Desiree to paint 2/5 of a wall. How much of a wall will Mary have painted when Desiree has finished painting one wall? Okay, so 1/4 of a wall is Mary, okay, and 2/5 of a wall is Desiree. By the time Desiree finishes one wall, I'm going to divide by that 2/5 on top and bottom. Let's see how much of a wall Mary will have finished. So I'm doing 1/4 divided by 2/5. And I'm going to flip this into a fraction, and it tells me I should get 5/8. So Mary will paint 5/8 of a wall by the time Desiree has finished painting one. Alright, and that is all that I have for lesson 12. If you have other questions, please let me know.